Yeah, welcome everyone to today's session. Thank you very much for joining. My name is Ian and I'm a junior consultant at Turner& Townsend. And today we're joined by Julian Boss, who's a principal consultant. So this is a retrofit information support and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero and being delivered by Turner& Townsend. I'll hand you over to Julian.
Thanks, Ian. Welcome everybody to the session on BS 40104. Scintillating title of that, but so it's a new standard from the British Standards Institute governing retrofit assessment. As Ian said, my name's Julian Boss. I'm a principal consultant with Turner & Townsend, and I've been working on domestic retrofit for a fair few years now. Our agenda for today, it looks like this. Basically, it starts with PAS, looks at then what retrofit assessment is and what part it plays within PAS, and then the BS 40104 and why that's come about, what it aims to address, and who it applies to. So PAS obviously is the overarching standard for our retrofit projects. And just a bit of background about PAS. Stands for Publicly Available Specification. It's technically not actually a standard, but is used very much in the retrofit sort of dictionary and language as a standard that people need to kind of comply with in terms of their domestic retrofit in order to be eligible for funding. In terms of BSI, that you can see on the right there, that is the cover for the latest version of PAS. That's the 2023 version. It is available free as a download from the BSI website, and as is PAS 2030 as well. The previous versions weren't free, but this one is. And there are various other standards like 2031, which manages the process of certification for PAS 2030. And then there's PAS 2038 as well, which is the one for non-domestic retrofit. So they're all kind of related. They're nothing to do with the year, the year, as in the year 2030 or the year 2035. That is a sort of just a curious coincidence with their numbering system. But it can be a little bit kind of confusing when you see that when the years 2030, 2035 and 2050 are all banded around in other contexts completely. But that's nothing to do with these. This just gives you a sort of slight sort of journey through the PAS 2035 process, starting from the top where you're bringing your project together. You're looking for engagement and advice with residents as well as other project stakeholders, thinking about your preliminary considerations. So it could be around fuel poverty, it could be around damp and mold issues, it could be around, any number of different considerations. You might have particular energy targets or EPC targets in the case of a lot of the government funding at the moment. Then you're looking to engage your retrofit coordinator at an early stage. They in turn would look at the appointment of assessors, designers, evaluations normally done by the retrofit coordinator as well. Coming down to the dwelling assessment, the retrofit assessment, and over here on the right, we got BS 7913. This is really around the significance of particular traditional or protected buildings. If you're in a conservation area or listed or any of those kind of factors that might apply to your dwellings, then you would need to have some kind of recognition of that consideration in terms of assessment and the suitable measures, particularly with listing. But conservation as well, if you're looking at external wall insulation, obviously a conservation areas quite often will refuse external wall insulation on the street front appearance of the property. You can do it at the back of the property, but not at the front, in which case internal wall insulation is often the option there. So moving further down, next stage, you're looking at the improvement option and evaluation and the medium-term plan. This is where you're looking at kind of selecting the retrofit options. Once you've done that, go into design. Once you've got your design, then you're into the PAS 2030 installation piece, which is all of these pieces of the installation work. So your pre-installation inspection, the installation, testing, commissioning, handover, and then a handover advice here quite often is done in coordination with the client's resident engagement or kind of officers as well as the installers. So they might well be involved in providing handover advice to residents, and that not being just a one-off kind of event. That's a kind of period of maybe several visits, several opportunities to let people know that they're available if residents still need more advice, they're a bit confused about maybe new ventilation systems or heating systems or anything that's different can obviously be, a little bit confusing. Monitoring and evaluation is down at this stage, just really to see that you've got the energy performance that you are paying for through the retrofit works. And then that can feed back into the top again in terms of maybe further investigation is needed if the energy performance or something is a little bit out of what the kind of parameters of what's expected or the target energy performance. If it's in keeping with what's predicted, then obviously that just needs to be kept an eye on. Otherwise, you might be looking at some kind of further investigation if energy use is wide of the mark in terms of where it should be. So just thinking about how retrofit programs are delivered. Again, this comes from the PAS documents, PAS 2035, which is, as I said, available from BSI. And these are just the kind of considerations you would have for all buildings, then your traditional and protected buildings, any high rise. They're different kind of elements that you would need to consider and bring into play as part of your PAS process for the different building types and situations. So it's really running through all those different stages that we showed in the first diagram as to what kind of additional activities you might be looking at. So things over here in terms of design and specification, they might well, you're looking at the air tightness strategy and thinking about the ventilation requirements post retrofit. So if you've been putting kind of different types of solid wall insulation, new windows and doors, those measures will all affect the air tightness of the property, and adequate ventilation is obviously a key thing to think about in terms of avoiding some of the unintended consequences such as damp, mold, health impacts, etc., of that reduced or improved air tightness. So you're reducing the drafts, the background ventilation, as it were, of the property by putting insulation and air tightness draft proofing measures in. And so you would need to be addressing the ventilation strategy, probably by putting in some constant demand control ventilation in. By that I mean you would have extract ventilators in conjunction with trickle vents around windows, and the ventilation units would be on a very low tick over rate normally, and as soon as they sense an increase in moisture or relative humidity within bathrooms and kitchens, those kind of areas where these sort of extract fans fitted, then the fan ramps up, and then once the moisture has been vented out, then and the relative humidity drops down to a sort of more acceptable levels, then the fans go back to their tick over level. Now, quite often that's a sort of new way of ventilating a dwelling, and that those kind of systems can cause confusion for residents, and it's not unknown for them to actually switch those things off completely. So in terms of handover, that's quite an important thing to bear in mind, is where you might have a new ventilation strategy and some kind of new systems in there. So when we're talking about retrofit assessment, key components, we've got the occupant assessment, condition survey, and then the energy report. Those are the kind of key parts of this, really looking at the kind of, I suppose, the understanding how many people we've got in the property, the kind of ages, their needs. If you're a young family with small children, or young working adults or older retired adults, obviously those things, and maybe vulnerable categories of people living there as well. So that's a big part of the whole point of retrofit obviously is for the residents, the occupants of the property, improve their comfort, affordability, and the sort of healthy environment they're in. So it's a key part of that. Condition of survey is really looking at any underlying issues with the building structure and the systems within the building. So making sure that things like heating, ventilation, what condition they're in, are they working properly, are they adequate, etc. And then the energy report as well. So, making note of any energy efficiency improvements that are already in place, thinking of the rating of the energy systems that are in there, etc. So it's those three parts really kind of make up the body of the assessment. So the role of the retrofit assessment: establish the baseline. So the assessment should evaluate the current condition of the property, including building fabric systems and controls, ventilation, air tightness, energy performance, identifying suitable measures. Obviously, the retrofit assessment is there to make sure that the measures you choose are suitable to that property. Not all measures are suitable for every property by any means, and you really need to be thinking about the compatibility, particularly around things like insulation types. So where you're looking at older solid wall buildings and the kind of materials that you're going to be putting if you're doing solid wall insulation, in terms of vapor open, vapor closed, it very much, it's a key part of the assessment role, is to be able to assist retrofit coordinators and designers in choosing the right materials and the right design work for the retrofit measures. Obviously, we've got health and safety, so checking for issues such as structural integrity, existing damp or mold issues, adequacy for ventilation. The next one, compliance and standards. Obviously, a retrofit assessment must be done in accordance with PAS 2035. I mean, that is the key part of this. The requirements of that assessment are very much kind of outlined in PAS 2035, although the 40104 is really reinforcing that and trying to put a kind of quality process and plan together for how those assessments need to be done. Creating a retrofit plan. So the assessment should inform a detailed plan, setting out short, medium, and long-term measures and aligning with homeowners' goals and budgets. This is really relating back to the idea that it's unlikely, well, but through the funded programs, we're obviously aiming for EPCC, but you could obviously go further with your retrofit work, taking property up to a B or an A. That would involve more expense, more disruption, and really those measures might be something you're looking at over a 10 to 15 to 20-year period, and that the assessment is really informing that medium to long-term map of the retrofit journey for those properties. Some of the issues with retrofit assessment can be incomplete or inaccurate data. So assessors often rely on visual inspections and homeowner provided information. There might be hidden defects, so gaps in insulation, like cavity wall insulation. There might be damp issues behind walls that go unnoticed. They might have limited access to certain areas like lofts and crawl spaces. And so assumptions have to be made, which when you come to actually doing retrofit works might prove to be wrong. But, we can't go in and do sort of invasive assessment on every property at an early stage. Variability in skills and standards. So quality depends heavily on the assessor's training and experience. So, and I think the emphasis on experience is quite pertinent here. Basically, people with more experience who are doing retrofit assessments can have, they particularly, I think, being experienced around buildings and seeing what the issues can be and how they present themselves can be a big advantage in gathering good data on these properties. So it's useful to have that depth of experience. Complexity of older buildings. Traditional or heritage buildings often have unique construction methods. Assessors may struggle to recommend measures without causing unintended consequences. In reality, assessors shouldn't be making recommendations actually about measures. The assessment is a pure data gathering process. The recommendation for measures is kind of something which is done on reflection by the retrofit coordinator, probably working with a designer, looking at the properties, looking at what is appropriate, what's feasible and reasonable to do on that property within budget. Complexity of older buildings can be significant just in terms of you might well be looking at things like solid wall insulation and where that is applied, where you have kind of doorways and entrances very close to windows. It can create a lot of difficult design work simply to maintain access. So yeah, there's quite a few considerations to be taken into account. Integration with retrofit design. So assessment data must feed into the retrofit plan accurately in order to maximize the value of that data. And poor communication between the assessor, coordinator, and the designer can cause mismatched solutions. Well, yeah, that goes without saying. It's absolutely fundamental that you get as good quality data as possible, so that people the designer and the retrofit coordinator are kind of equipped and making their best decisions possible with the information they have to hand. Lack of digital tools. This is still an area which could be massively improved. Many assessments still rely on manual notes and spreadsheets, working on site literally with a pad and paper, limited use of advanced tools like thermal imaging or tightness testing. It's still pretty uncommon, really. Having said that, thermal imaging you can only really do when the conditions are right. So when people are visiting to do assessments of properties, quite often thermal imaging is they recommend a temperature difference internal to outdoor of 10 to 15 degrees. So it's generally something you would do in the wintertime. Data interoperability between software platforms is often poor as well. So again, we haven't got standards established yet which can communicate between different platforms very easily. So these are the sort of things to consider, when you're thinking about doing a big program of retrofit, is to align all these things so you avoid any potential issues of mismatch of different platforms and tools. So on to the new BS 40104 and how it aims to address these issues. So what is BS 40104? It's the retrofit assessment for domestic dwellings, and it's a new British standard that provides a comprehensive framework for assessing homes prior to retrofit work. Its aim is, and you can see around that sort of infinity image, improving consistency. There is a growing recognition that retrofit assessments, which underpin the design and delivery of funded domestic retrofit work across the UK, vary significantly in their reliability and quality. So one of the fundamental principles of the new standard is making them consistent, so that again you've got a standardized way of gathering data and in breadth and depth of that data. Improving processes. BS 40104 has been developed to address the situation of the inconsistency in process, aims to standardize the process, ensuring that all assessments are thorough, rigorous, and based on best practice. The carbon reduction targets. The government has set ambitious targets for reducing carbon emissions and tackling fuel poverty. Improving the energy efficiency of domestic dwellings is central to addressing these goals. BS 40104 supports this by promoting more accurate and effective retrofit planning, which can lead to a better energy performance outcomes. And again, it's really about consistency. It's about having better and more trustworthy data, more reliable, more consistent, so that you can compare apples to apples, to use that overused term. But it's very much about making sure that as many retrofit assessments as possible can be understood to be a certain type of process. Promoting quality, that last part of the diagram there. So poorly designed or installed retrofit can lead to unintended consequences, as we know, such as damp, mold, overheating, which can have significant impacts on occupant health. A more thorough, reliable assessment process helps to minimize these impacts by identifying and mitigating such risks early in the planning phase. So again, that's coming back to this idea of making sure that the assessments are thorough and that they look for all the signs of issues around damp, mold, maybe structural problems, structural issues, and they really are kind of maintaining a consistency around the quality of those assessments. The areas of focus. So we've got context. So this is when you're thinking about the information you need when designing, well, choosing and designing different retrofit measures for properties. Looking at the context is hugely important. So it's appraisal of the dwelling to allow for U values, moisture characteristics being established, any constraint presented by the site of the dwelling which may affect any proposed work. So that can include access, storage. If you're looking at solid wall insulation, there's an awful lot of material to be stored temporarily somewhere nearby. If it's access, you might have a detached house or semi-detached house, which is in close proximity to walls or fences or anything else. And maybe the measure that you're doing, if it's external wall insulation, might restrict that to an unacceptable level. So these are the different kind of things you should be thinking about in terms of the context. In terms of condition, really evaluating the state of the building's fabric and systems. So yeah, we're looking at the age and whether those systems are in good working order or whether they've been installed properly. Really looking to see if the workmanship of the previous installation or existing installation is of acceptable quality, acceptable in terms of how it's been fitted to the particular context that it's in, and whether you can establish that it's been properly serviced, etc., etc. So the kind of condition of the systems that are in the building as they are at the moment. Next, we're looking at occupancy, as I mentioned earlier. So considering how the home is used and by whom, the levels and types of occupancy in the dwelling, including special considerations, such as vulnerable people who may be using the building, i.e. children, elderly, or anyone with disabilities. And the formalised occupancy assessment may affect the outcome of the energy performance calculations. Ventilation assessment also, as I mentioned earlier, when you're doing improvements to a building fabric, so walls, windows, doors, really needing to be very aware of how that's impacting the existing ventilation system in terms of what will be required after the retrofit. The ventilation assessment includes any continuous or intermittent ventilation system needs to be assessed in accordance with a particular BISRIA document. Any ventilation system should be recorded and its area of coverage, condition, and working status. Identification, functionality, and condition of any background ventilation. Also, such as trickle vents. Quite often trickle vents you will find have been taped over to tape them closed and inoperable. Any purge ventilation, opening of windows, ventilation paths, undercut of doors, etc., or maybe permanent air bricks within properties. Any of this stuff should be recorded. And where required, an air permeability measurement should be carried out in accordance with a recognised standard. So we're talking about air pressure testing, which could be a pulse test or a door pressurization test. And we've also got the energy performance assessment, recording the energy performance characteristics of the dwelling. So asking about smart meters, energy displays, particular energy tariffs that occupants might be using, ideas of energy consumption, etc. And then that data would be inputted into one of those kind of modeling. If you're doing RD SAP or PHPP energy modeling, then the data would be imported into that. In terms of significance, obviously we mentioned this earlier, so more focus on heritage and historic importance. So where a building is identified as traditional, an assessment can be made using the simplified version of BS 7913, which is the Guide to Conservation of Historic Buildings. And where a building is defined as protected, then a full assessment of significance should be made under BS 7913. So who would work under this new standard? The intended users, obviously assessors, but they would also impact to different degrees on designers, coordinators, building surveyors, and a number of other professionals. But it's primarily the retrofit assessors who are going to be working under this new standard. And as I say, its main purpose is really to bring all assessments up to a kind of best practice level of quality, because I think the main thing to remember is that everything else that happens within a retrofit project kind of follows on from the assessment, making sure you've got as good data as possible about the condition of the building and the systems in it, who's living in the building and how they use it, and what the systems are that are there at the moment. And without that kind of information as a sort of baseline and having that consistently across all your properties, it's very difficult to put together a really, really good quality retrofit design. So we're trying to establish as good a starting point as possible. So just the last sort of few key things to remember as a summary: the new BS 40104 works alongside PAS 2035, PAS 2030 and PAS 2038. As I said, PAS 2038 is for non-domestic buildings, and the new standard is basically part of that sort of family of standards, if you like. They are all closely connected. It addresses variability in quality and reliability of retrofit assessments, hoping to bring all of the new assessments working under this standard up to a sort of best practice level of quality. Fire, electrical and gas safety assessments and structural assessments aren't covered by this standard, but should be covered by other standards or specialist assessments. So this is very much a standard focusing on the retrofit assessment for PAS 2035, PAS 2038 and PAS 2030 projects. Just a few bits of information about other resources coming through on the RISE calendar, and just a reminder of other resources available on the RISE website as well.